multicultural worship lessons from a lifetime of exploration. And that might be a bit overstated, it might be just a tad overstated, but I do think that I have always been interested in other cultures. I've always, from the very beginning of school, when I started learning about social studies and all those things, I was just so curious about anything that has to do with any other kind of culture, and interested always in how someone else did something different than we did, or that was my practice, or my family's practice. I also can remember as a very small child visiting relatives, primarily in Florida, and I can remember even as had to be no more than 4 or 5 years old, and I remember a lot about the worship services that we went to with my relatives that were very different than the ones we had in our little country church in Alabama. So I can remember those specifically, what it looked like, what it felt like, the different instruments, the way people sang. I can even remember a choral anthem from those years. So I know that's weird and something that would be hard to imagine, but I was so in tune with church always. My dad was the epitome of a great churchman. And I think I learned to love the church from the model that my dad set for me. And I went to everything. My family did as well, but loved church always. So what does multicultural worship look like? We start out with a couple of quotations here. This Barbara Brown Taylor quote says, "The only thing we cannot do is hold on to Jesus. He has asked us, please not to do that, because he knows that all in all we would rather keep him with us where we are than let him take us where he is going. Better we should let him hold on to us, perhaps. Better we should let him take us into the white hot presence of God, who is not behind us, but ahead of us every step of the way." And then another quote, and then we'll pause for a moment, a quote by Karen Ward, whose work I followed at different times through my career. "In order for the gospel of Christ to be received, it must be communicated in, with, and under the cultural vernaculars of God's people in all their particularity." So from those two quotes, you've not had a lot of time to think on that and dwell on it, but what are some things that you notice or some ideas that you pick up from these, this Barbara Brown Taylor quote and this other quote by Karen Ward? Some things that stand out to you.
Fear not.
Okay.
Maybe different, may not be what you're expecting or wanting, but who knows what we can.
Okay. Well said. Anybody else?
Going, not staying in our usual space.
Yes. Not being okay staying put. Yes. Well said. Others. I'd love for us to be a bit participatory if you are willing.
Don't try to put God in the box.
Okay?
It doesn't always fit in what our cultural, view. Maybe everybody has different viewpoints.
Yes.
Well, and I think, especially the second quote, the way the gospel is presented, coming from my background, is not thinking about your background.
Yes. Yes. And those may be very different.
And those can be very different,
Yes.
especially Florida and Alabama.
I'm just saying. Yes. Which we'll get back to, that how different do you have to be to be multicultural or cross-cultural? That's one of the questions that we'll ask in this session. Yeah, well, that gives us a lot to think about from the beginning of these quotes. And I'd then say all worshiping communities are in some way already multicultural. So we have already some multicultures represented in any one community. No community is monoculture. Even a community that someone would say, all those people are whatever. Well, they don't know all those people. Again, being from a very small rural community, growing up there until I went to college, it always bothered me, and bothers me even more now, that people assume that all rural people are the same.
Amen.
Because they're very much not. they're very diverse. You just have to have the right lens to see the level of diversity and the difference in this family versus that family and how this family functions and then what they bring to the church and all this kind of stuff. And when you grow up in a community where you know the lineage of families for generations, you also know what many of those families carry along with them and what their peculiarities are, to quote one of our authors. So how is it that we are, cross-cultural worship borrows from one other culture, okay? And then multicultural worship borrows from multiple cross-cultures. So how is that played out in a place? And what examples can you see from maybe your own experience or your own context? What are some examples of how that might occur?
One of them is just in the kind of music that we use. That we'll draw from Latin and different European cultures. We'll draw from Celtic culture, which has a lot of proto-Christian stuff in it. And so we're already, even if all of us are white, still drawing things from multiple cultures just to get where we are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
White is a color, not a culture.
Right.
Okay.
Sure.
As are other. Yes. And they're not all the same by any. Yeah. It's really. I think it's a lot like judging people. I don't know how you are about this, but every time I judge somebody, I find out I was wrong. When I actually get to know the person, I think, oh my gosh, you were so wrong. You didn't even have a clue, because I realize that they're much more complex than I imagined in my lack of knowledge. Yeah. Let's ask this question. I had thought about starting our session today with this, but I think we had a beautiful and most meaningful example of multicultural worship this morning. Cross-cultural worship, for sure. What are some of the ways that this morning's worship was a multicultural experience?
Languages.
Okay. Languages. We used at least 3. I might have missed one, but at least 3.
And not only that, but we had the different cultures of different generations
Mhm.
involved in different ways.
Amen.
That was great.
Yes.
And probably,
Instrumentation, moving from African rhythm, contemporary organ as a
Yeah.
and probably a part of culture is the religion of the man or woman, but, not everyone was raised, this is a Baptist institute, but not even everyone in this room is. So.
We're very different in denominational perspectives.
Yes.
I mean, and that's even, you can't judge by denominations anymore, though. That's certainly not a way you can imagine. You can't go into any particular church with a particular top name and expect that this is what I'm going to get in this church. Yeah. I'm sometimes asked, well, at Baylor, do you all just teach Baptist church music? I have no idea what Baptist church music is. No clue. I don't think we Baptists have ever known, but we certainly don't know now if we ever did. So it would be one person's evaluation of what that might be. So we certainly don't do that. What are some other multicultural dimensions to that?
I appreciated actually started it, Geraldine's invitation for us in whatever space we're in. So it wasn't just, okay, everyone start talking, or everyone do this, or everyone do that. And so that reached
Yes.
the multicultural aspect in the sanctuary.
We were given an opportunity to come from our own space how many different musical styles were represented. And fusions of musical styles and subfusions and, that's beyond my, I know a lot about music, but not that much really, when you get into it.
I love the involved the worship live kids, because here I have this young man sitting next to me and, we're singing the one song and he's like, he doesn't even look at the words, he just does it. And then we get the song, it's Alleluia, and he's going, if I'm uncomfortable, and so with that back, that's so great, I love that.
I love the way you guys carried and joined that. Love the way you included the young people. That was the biggest home run that we've ever had with absolutely I thought to give a space where those kids brought something, and it was the perfect thing where they brought something to the worship. We didn't give them something. They gave the gift, and we were the receivers. And when we get into hospitality a little bit, they brought the gift, and what was your perception of the position where they stood, or their posture, not literal posture, but as they were the bringer of the gift? How did you feel that they felt?
There was an abandonment.
Yes.
That was fresh.
Yes, it was very fresh.
Joy.
Joy. Yeah. It was the true joy of getting a gift, right?
Yes.
I think any mature person would rather give a gift any day than receive one. Yeah. I think that's a mark of maturity, when you get to the place where you really don't really care. A lot of you love to give things, but receiving them is fine, but not a requirement at all. But while giving is just such amazing joy. That's one of the places where I knew at some point I was growing up, when I didn't ask for much anymore. But the joy of giving, and that's what those young people brought today, I thought, was just, just like almost like a preschool, I've got something amazing for you, and I can't wait for you to open it. I was right in the middle of some of the young people, and I was just loving the sense of that. Maybe I was putting a lot of imagination into their hearts, but that's what I was feeling, and I love that. But there were so many, many moments today where there were so many cross-cultural things, and that's not even to mention the complexity of the worship team, the people from different countries, and people in the room from all over the place. That's not even to bring in the obvious, those kinds of things. It's nothing to mention even about that. It was much bigger than that, much more broad than that. If you turn the page, steps to becoming cross-cultural. And one is awareness. And the next one is understanding, acceptance, appreciation, and selective adoption. So to become cross-cultural, there's an awareness. Like I mentioned, if you are stereotyping, all people in Gainesville, Georgia are the same or something, that simply means you're not aware. You don't know. And you don't know why you would want to know these things, or why you would want this different perspective until you are aware that there is this that happened. Do you remember the first time that you ever spent the night in a home that wasn't your parents or your relatives? So have you ever thought about that? And you realized, everybody doesn't do it the way we do, whatever it is. But food and breakfast and getting up and routine and just all sorts of things. You just think, this isn't our way to do it. As a child, I didn't like to stay away from home. I liked to be at home because I wasn't confident enough to be okay in all those other spaces yet. And so there's a level of confidence that comes from that cross-cultural, but the awareness, and then an understanding. Well, why is it? See, that's how many times do you think in our culture? Don't answer this because it might not be a good answer, a free answer. But how many times in our culture do you think we become aware that people are different than we and have a different story, but we don't go any further than that? Because if the second one is understanding, we don't really want to understand. We just want to critique. We just want to criticize them for being different. We don't really want, if I understood them, I actually might accept them. But I don't want to accept them, so I would dare not try to understand. You see how we get in these ruts, as it were, and then even to appreciate. But then even to adopt some of those practices would be yet another kind of space to go. Now, could you dive in for just a little bit to think about your own church experience, and without going anybody too deep, or too long, but could you think about for a little bit something that has changed your congregation and how it was that the presence of someone or something changed? How did one thing make a difference, and what was that one thing, rather than just saying we shifted? What was the catalyst for that change? Because sometimes if we can understand the catalyst, then we can understand better how to lead in change or to bring about a greater awareness.
Seems like relationships, having someone that we build a relationship, someone new shows up, you actually build a relationship with that person and discover those differences, different thinking, different expectations, different background, different story, and as you build those relationships, you say, because I love you, I would be willing to not have my preferences met, to not spend all of my time telling my own story so that there is room to hear your story.
Yes.
And that selflessness, and I think that selflessness only comes through learning to love the person, that relationships. I think it starts with relationships, in a very personal and not even an academic or an abstract way.
Well said. Yeah.
This kind of goes along with that, but when you first mentioned what has kind of changed things, anytime there's a change in leadership, it's not necessarily a huge change, but it still is a change, and especially as a director of music, you're trying to find your place and how that relationship, how you fit together with that new community.
Are your wheels turning a little bit? I hope. I'm thinking. An example. What about somebody that moves to your community and they play an instrument that has not been previously represented in your church, and it happens to be one that you'd like to use, which I think we should. But what about that, and how might that presence of that person change the dynamics of your community's worship? I was thinking back to being a kid. When I was in 8th grade, my uncle, my dad's brother, retired from the military, and they moved back to the community where my aunt and uncle had grown up, which was our community, joined our church. They had 6 kids. Well, 6 children, mostly teenagers down, 6 children in a community that has about 80 people in the church on Sunday. That's enough to really change the dynamics of the community. They were musical. My cousins were, as were my brother and my brothers and me, and some other ones of us. So the joining of their gifts and our family's gifts and a few pickups that are here, we suddenly had a whole youth group of people that were quite musical. And we were singing together and we were doing all these musical things. And for a period of time, it really changed the whole culture of our congregation. And we were not interested in singing the hymns out of the Robin hymnal necessarily. We thought Sing and Celebrate was just the most amazing thing that had ever hit the market, and cotton candy clouds and all kinds of things that we were interested in. You see, but that was a cultural shift, and it changed many, many, many things. We did dramatic things. We dressed up. We did all sorts of things. You see how that situation changed. Have you ever had a person leave your congregation who is highly valued in some way, and then even your shifts occur, and then you have many of those, and then things change. Does cross-cultural or multicultural always imply international?
No.
Okay, that's one thing I wanted us to think about today, is it does not mean we have to have really, really different cultures. But I don't really believe sometimes that our faraway cultures are as different, they're not more different, yes, more different. They're not more different than some of our local cultures that we have yet to come in contact with. I use an example. A number of years ago, I had a student who was doing a mentoring experience here at Truett. And, well, this is before the mentoring agreement. He became a minister of music at a church outside of Waco, slightly outside of Waco, just barely, but more of a blue-collar community, okay, I would say. Well, he kept coming to me. I realized things were not going well in his church, and he would come to me a lot of times on Monday and say, Dr. Bradley, help me. I don't know what these people are thinking. I don't know. Help me understand what's going on here. I felt like I didn't communicate. And I would explain, well, this is what they meant, and they did this, and they did that, and I said, well, this is what they meant. And he finally said, how do you know all this? How do you know all this about me? And I said, well, these are my people. These are people I know these kind of people. It occurred to me that I believe that this student would have been more comfortable in Hong Kong in a metropolitan area or Tokyo, because this city culture would have had more in common than this rural / blue-collar-esque culture had. And that he would have been much more comfortable and had fewer missteps and stepped into the wrong spaces and said the wrong things to people. Because he just didn't, it was just like another language. It was just as if I were telling him, speaking completely non-English when I would talk to him. So that was the first time I ever realized that. And it was at that point that I stopped pushing, I get to say pushing. I stopped really strongly encouraging all of our students to go out and get little church positions all the way around. Because I realized sometimes it was not helpful for them.
Can I ask what you did as a result of figuring this out? Did the young man stay in that position?
He did. He did for a while, but he never
Never got to the comfort
completely
zone.
got it.
Yeah.
And I met with him a week or two ago, and he is no way is he anything but a city kid. I mean, very, very much and he's not a kid anymore.
Right.
But it's just very interesting. Now, there are those people that can go multicultural and you can go all over the place. I call those people are well-traveled. And when I'm doing references for students, I'll often say, this student just travels well anywhere. Travel well around anybody. Whatever the culture is, the student just understands people in some really deep, deep way that transcends culture. Yeah. And that's a different skill. And those are the skills I really, really try to encourage our students to have. And that's one of the reasons that here at Baylor we try to take them on trips all over the world, because at least sometimes you do better in a very different culture than you do in a similar culture. Have you noticed that? It's oftentimes more difficult to deal with the differences of your neighbor. You might have a neighbor who's politically different than you, and you're really, 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 really annoyed with that. But you're okay to go across the world and deal with somebody who may be so very, very much different than your politics are. See, the closer they are to you, the more more challenging it can be sometimes to accept those differences.
I had an epiphany about a story of the Tower of Babylon in Genesis that this relates to. And sometimes we get too tied into the words that we're using in biblical language. And I realize that story is being repeated in our culture today, in our capacity not to communicate, our inability to communicate with the person who's right next to us. It's not about the language being confused. It's about how we communicate what's inside us with one another.
I think that we were, I think Richard said, it comes from love. And I'll say, this is where I first became aware of this. I was, years ago, as a college student and as a young teacher, I was in the church for a number of years in Alabama, my home state. And the person who was, at that time, the Baptist state music director person, he introduced me in an event one time and talked about the ministry that I had done in this small church, and he said he modeled how you can love people into change. Now, I don't say that to say about I'm such a great person to love people into change, but I say that as the light went off in my head that change comes from love, not from force, not from many, many, many other things. And so I've not successfully done it, but I've tried through the years to love people into change rather than the many other ways. You rarely can convince someone. You can't argue it. You can't. That's one of the reasons, and I may be stepping on toes here, but I sometimes tell my students that are very much here in the apologetics club or something, I say, we can't talk each other into faith issues, I don't think. We love into faith issues. We don't reason our way. At least it's not been my entry point. So I think loving is our starting space. Yes, consider cross-cultural living requires some sacrifice of one's primary culture. So we have to, I think somebody already said that. Who said that over in here already, that we have to give up something? Richard said that, yeah. We have to give up something if we're going to take on something else. An example, and I always, when I talk about multicultural stuff, I almost always go to food, partly because I'm a foodie to the core, and you can look at me and tell me I absolutely love food. I've hardly ever met anything I didn't like. But I love food, but I love food not just because I also love what it tells us about people. And I am just absolutely addicted to trying all the food everywhere I go. I just want to try it all and get an experience with all of it. But food is one of the ways that if you want to learn to love other kinds of food, you can't eat the same food that you've always eaten every day and then start eating something else as well. Like 2 days ago, I had Thai food for dinner because it's one of, if not my favorite. And I couldn't eat this food I grew up with and every day and also eat some Thai food and have Mexican food another day and have pizza another day and all these different kinds of foods. I grew up eating very basic food. It was just like whatever was in our freezer and what we put up in the summer, and it's very basic food, which I learned to believe now is really amazing. But at the time, it was just boring food that we had all the time. It was before it was cool. I was, what's the song? Country before country became cool or something. But I had a teacher one time that said, I grew up eating peas and cornbread, but I've learned to like a lot of other foods now. And they just left it at that. Or else to figure out what he meant by that. So, he was talking about music. But he just left it hanging. But I've never forgotten it. Never forgot that. One of the implications of this giving something up requires some sacrifice. What the implications of that, and how can one become fluent in more than one culture? I'll answer the question by saying I believe yes, but I do think we will always have a home culture. My friend Maria Montero, who is here this week, and some of you know Maria well, she is originally from Brazil, so she speaks Portuguese. She is the music minister at First Mexican Baptist Church in San Antonio. So she works in Spanish and English there. it's interesting to talk to her about cultural shifts and cultural differences and having a home culture and other cultures and how that all works together. But I do think we can become fluent maybe to broad a statement, but I think we find our way around well in other cultures.
Music is a powerful spur for
Yes.
that. Our current music director at my church didn't speak a word of English because he grew up in Costa Rica. At the age of 8 or 9, he moved to the United States, and music has been his avenue into the English language, into our culture, into a number of other languages and cultures.
Yeah. I was going to say something kind of along with that, but I got very engrossed in your statement and forgot what I was going to say, which was what I should have done. Yeah, I think that I can cook different kinds of food, like maybe some Mexican food and some this. What I'm really good at cooking is just home cooking from the Deep South. I can make some good cornbread and some things like that, because that's really that's the food of my origin. Richard.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt.
Go ahead.
Can you speak to cultural appropriation and how do we navigate the
Absolutely. No, absolutely. But I would be happy to. I had that in this handout and I took it out because it's a more difficult topic. And I took it out. Well, I had someone else look at the handout and I took it out because they took it out. Cultural appropriation, and I had some definitions and things like that. But cultural appropriation, to my understanding, is when we use another culture, but not necessarily in a positive way, or not necessarily with positive intent. So it could be some, or lack of understanding is really the bigger part of it. We use it without a lack of understanding of that culture. So, an example of that. A few years ago, the Baylor Men's Choir was sang at a big national convention, the American Choral Directors Association. We did a piece from the movie Selma. And it was, I can't remember the name of the piece, but anyway, it's all about, it's one of the biggest piece, most well known from that movie. Well, I realized that by doing that piece, we were risking cultural appropriation because we were a primarily white choir singing this music that came from an African American context. So I wanted to be sure that we had the best understanding we could possibly have of why we were doing this. So I invited 3 guests, 3 African American scholars on campus to come and talk to us about their thoughts about what we were doing and how we might sing this appropriately, not appropriation, but how we could sing it honestly. So we did a lot of soul searching about that. We watched the movie in the original context. We did a good bit of study. We had some of these lectures and stuff like that. But what we did was go into it with a great deal of understanding. And then we had conversation about, now, who are we in the position of this piece? That we are joining with these people in solidarity for their rights and et cetera, rather than we are just mimicking their story and singing it out of some level of, we just like this music and we're some way just mimicking it. So as we talked about that a lot, I started to think about other places where we don't think about cultural appropriation, but it could be true. A part of our choral staple, our choral masterworks in America is the spiritual. Now, many of those have been arranged by African American composers, but not all of them by any means. But we have taken those as absolutely, this is part of our culture. Now, we have, in more recent years, it is most appropriate to sing spirituals with greater knowledge of African Americanisms, speech-wise and broader vowels and things like that, than it is to just sing it as in a Western way. But in reality, 40 years ago, the only multicultural music most of us would have sung in choral works would be languages from other places, which were probably still Western art music, but languages and spirituals. And that's all I can remember singing in college. Now, in the 90s, we started singing music from all over the world, and all languages and everything really shifted. And that was a very enlightening experience for me. It was wonderful because I was so enlivened by this new music that certainly brought kind of the world to life for me. And that's kind of where some of this study became so interesting and engaging for me. Then we started thinking, well, we've got to get the pronunciations right. We have to do as much as we can to be in the original context, get the instrumental meanings right and all that stuff. So what I would say, Richard, to say all of that, but what I would say is I do not think, say, if our choir at church sings a song from Kenya, which we've done, because I have a strong affiliation with Kenya, or some other country, for instance, we've sung Asian things, I don't think we are dealing on the dark side of cultural appropriation, because we are in a place of identifying with our Christian brothers and sisters and trying to step into their space and in solidarity with them. I have a whole section in here about solidarity, and I took that out too, because there's too much material. But I think that we are in solidarity with people that we may have yet to meet. Now, if we can talk about that from experience, then that is better. If we can say, I learned this from my friend, I learned this when I was here, when I was there. If someone from that culture can teach it to us, then we've even stepped further down the right line. But I wonder, is it culturally inappropriate for us to sing Baroque music when we have been singing country music? You see, we don't ask those questions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we sing Baroque music with all kinds of instrumentation, whatever we have. We change the solos, we give them to whoever can sing them, which we believe that Handel did. You know, it's very flexible, you know. So that's been much more my approach, is music should not, I really believe that when we put music into the public sphere, we should loosen our grip on it. I have the same opinion, which is probably a minority opinion, that I try to do what the composer wrote in the music, like dynamics and tempo and things like that. But I don't always do that, because sometimes I think composers don't get that right. We have composers in here, we have had, they're all over the place around here, but I think sometimes they don't get that right. A few years ago, the Bangor Men's Choir opened our fall, the Parents Weekend concert, the first thing we do every year. We opened that concert with a piece by a very well-known composer. And then the next day, I got this bit of a lengthy email about how I had taken the tempo wrong. That that's not the tempo he wrote, and I'd taken the tempo wrong. No thanks for buying this piece, 100 copies of it, or anything like that. But I politely told him I thought he wrote it with the wrong tempo mark. I was very nice about it, but I do believe that his tempo was not good for our group and our space and our context. So I think once you put something out there, you show gratitude when people try to use what you do, rather than holding on to it so tightly and believing somehow it was yours to begin with. I am big about the whole idea of mine. As I have taken groups all over the world, one of the things that I've done in every single culture is we have taken the music of that culture to them, their music back to them as a gift, that we cared enough about you to learn something with your language, with your music. And I have found that to be the thing that people come
not to assume separation, person to person or culture to culture, that the things that we put out into the world as expression become part of human culture. And unless we're intending to be separated and isolated from one another, then those things are means by which we stitch ourselves together.
Yes, I completely agree with that. Another thing, Richard, that comes up sometimes is the whole definition of tokenism. And that's when one thing, as I understand it, becomes representative of all. You say, the music of whatever is like this. Yeah. Well, that's where, like for instance, if I were to show one of my many places of ignorance, I'm not very, I don't know a lot about guitar riffs and heavy metal music, or rock music of the 70s. So sometimes I will hear a story, listen to a story or something on NPR or wherever, but I listen to some story about this amazing, riff and somebody, whatever. And I'm like, I don't really understand why that was so great. It's so different than this other thing. But that's not on the riff, it's on me. Yeah. I'll tell you a story that's been very telling and important for me. A number of years ago, maybe like my kids say, Dad, you say a few years ago, and you mean 40 years ago. Say, was it recent or not? Really, not a few years ago. This was about 30 years ago. So I had this person that I worked with who told the story one day, and he said, there were these two guys in an art museum, and this one guy was saying, oh my gosh, look at that, look at the texture, and those colors are amazing. Wow, and just explaining and just talking in great amazement. And the other guy said, well, to me, it looks like a whole bunch of paint just splattered on the canvas. I don't see anything in it. And the first guy said, but don't you wish you could? And that has just haunted me. And I tell that to my students, and I say, let's stand in the position of don't you wish you could. So rather than be critical, what's the Ted Lasso's? Let's not be judgmental. Let's not be judgmental. Let's curious, not critical. Let's be curious, not critical. So that's been the motto of recent groups about let's be curious and not critical. Yeah, and that's a very, very different thing. But I always think about that. Don't you wish you could? So what kind of good questions might I ask rather than just passing my judgment? This is just me, but I really don't like for somebody to say, I don't like fill in the blank kind of food. I've had people say, I cannot stand turnips. I don't understand how anybody can eat turnips. And they're talking about greens. To me, turnips are greens. And I'm like, well, you've not tried my mom's greens. My mom, you'd have to love those. I mean, why would you not? Funny story about my mother. A few years ago, we had my late wife and I took a group of students didn't have anywhere to go over a holiday, so we took them to Alabama with us. Well, my mother fixed grits. Oh gosh, that always we had grits every meal, every breakfast. So my mother fixed grits. Well, the first day, one of the guys said, he didn't eat them very much. Well, she said, I don't think you like those grits. She just can't talk about it. Well, the next day she fixed cheese grits. And she said, I know you're going to like these grits. And he didn't really like those either. But she could not get it in her mind that anybody on the planet would not like grits. She did not. She could not make that. It was beyond her comprehension that you could be someone and not love grits. She just couldn't believe that. So anyway, yeah. Let's move on. We must evaluate our own identity in Christ. How do I understand my identity as one who stands in relationship to God? And how do I understand and interact with another whose identity is also related to God?
Image of God.
Yes, and I would vary the imago Dei, or the image of God, in all of us. But I would really, really, really encourage you and me to keep on thinking about that statement. Because if I'm in the image of God, and you are in the image of God, and your identity is found in God, to be very, very, very careful before I start saying my identity is real and yours is fake. I'm just convicted by that. I don't say I always live into that well, and it's one of the places where I have room to grow for sure. But we must, you get it. We are drawn together as the body of Christ, not to serve ourselves, but to participate in the body of Christ for the sake of Christ. So more things to think about. Is becoming a multicultural congregation a choice for a church that seeks to follow God? And I ask that because, the world is shrinking and single cultures are a rarity, or maybe not even existent. You can always break a culture down into more slices. Worshiping communities are typically made up of 2 or more cultures. We've already established that. Christian hospitality calls us to acknowledge each other. And then we're going to get a little bit more into hospitality in a little bit. Well, let's just go ahead and say hospitality is at the bottom of the page, the host, stranger, guest. It is welcoming. If you are the host, it's welcoming the stranger, and then the stranger becomes the guest. And then the guest offers gifts, and then we receive those gifts. And the circle of hospitality, it's always in a circle, and hospitality is always reciprocal. The circle is not complete until I've given you a gift, you have now given me a gift. So for instance, if Janine were to come to my house for dinner, and I were to prepare a dinner that I felt like was honoring to her presence, and then, so she receives the gift of my hospitality. She offers, what is her gift of hospitality then? Do what? She eats the food. And she hopefully likes the food, and she hopefully...
And even if she doesn't, she eats it.
That's what I always tell us. That's what I always tell my students. You eat it anyway.
And she says thank you.
And she says thank you, and then she has then received the gift. How many times have you given a gift that somebody didn't accept well? I'm not going to say they just threw it in your face, but they didn't accept it well. Have you ever had that happen? It's a terrible thing, isn't it? It's a terrible, terrible thing. So many times we are comfortable with the giving of the gift, but we're not so comfortable with receiving the gift. What about my wonderful neighbor whom I love dearly, who gives me sweets a lot? Yes. And she gives me these wonderful gifts of sweets. Well, do I take them or do I refuse them because I don't need them? I take them, and I take them with great joy, and it gives me immense pleasure that she gave these to me. And then I eat a few, and then I give away and share some with my friends. And I pass them out in class. And sometimes I tell her, I share these with my friends and they love these, something, and that makes her more happy. But she gives to me. Now, what am I giving to her? Gratitude and acceptance, and I do other things for her. We have a relationship. We trade things.
And the joy she gets from giving.
Yes, the joy of giving is so beautiful, isn't it? Yeah. But what about when you have people that come to your house to eat, for instance, and they come and they eat the meal, and then they're right out of the door, like my cousins at reunions. Like, I came a long way, by golly, and I wanted to visit with y'all, and y'all just came to eat and hurry out the door. Yeah, this is recorded, actually. Anyway, but whomever, you see, that is not complete the cycle at all. Multicultural worship enables us to know God more broadly and more deeply. I believe that knowing, that experiencing God in other places, in other locations, and in other ways, in ways that are not yet familiar to us, is a way that the size of our God grows. And I talk to students a lot about, let's be in pursuit, you all, for a bigger God. Let's be pursuing a God that outpaces the size of ourselves. Because most of us are on a journey to bring God down to our size. We want a God that's no bigger than we are, that we can take on and win. We are threatened when God is bigger than we are, and God challenges us to grow in some way that we have not yet grown. Now, am I picking at you when I say that?
Yes.
I am really convicting myself because I am not perfect in these things, but I do believe this. I absolutely believe it. I know that I have a lot of work to do. So I talk to students a lot about a bigger God. Let's pursue a bigger God. And every time we are accepting of other people in these different faith experiences, our God grows and we say, oh, whoa, you're really over there too. I had no idea. Like this year, taking a group of students to Kenya, that God was present there. We didn't bring God to them. We didn't introduce them to God for the first time. They already knew about God. Maybe they knew more than we did. Yeah. Each time we identify with Christians who are different than we, the size of our God is expanding. So that we don't run completely out of time, I'm going to let you look at the rest of that later. And then let's, implications for worship. I believe that worship should be progressing toward being multicultural, because I believe that this multicultural I don't think I should have to convince you. So, rather than worship being viewed as a niche market, should be viewed as inclusive and inviting. Because oftentimes, at least if you grew up in the 90s, you taught the word worship as, you know, this kind of church and this market of people we're trying to get, and we're trying to get the seekers and the boomers and the whomever. And I don't think that's the way it should be. It should be inclusive and inviting to all people. Yeah. We've already talked a bit about hospitality. We'll just skip that one for now. Worship should look like the congregation, and the congregation should reflect the community around the church. That's convicting in our community, because our community is not always looking like our church does not always look like our community. It's not the other way around. We have a lot of growth to go there. So I say it should look like the congregation, but it should look like the congregation, but with an eye on becoming more. So it should be both local and global, which is exactly what I say next. Should reflect the body of Christ while drawing the global church into dialogue. So when we do multicultural music, perhaps, we are dialoguing with another culture that we want to give a place at some future that we're exploring. We are showing that there is more. Music is a useful resource for assembling multicultural worship, and yeah, our context will always affect our worldviews. And we are not separated from who we are. Instead, we become creatures in that context. And then I wrote in parentheses, but we can change. That was my parenthetical statement, but we can change. We don't say, I am the way I am. I really try not to ever say, well, I'm just this. I'm just this. I try to think of, I am this until I become something different or someone different. Because as a Christ follower, I would not be following in the steps of Jesus if I am accepting myself as a finished product. Mm-hmm. So we are not ever finished. What is love divine or love's excelling? What's the text on the last ends of that? Change from glory into glory. That I am convicted by that text. I don't know what it means completely, because I don't know that I'm gloried on the first hand, you know. But I will be changed from glory into glory, and I'm hopeful because of that. Begin with simple steps. There's a few other things there. What does it mean to have a Catholic personality? A universal personality. Yeah. Begin with simple steps. Include others in the worship planning process can be a really great way to begin to explore. Utilize others to help make to grow into something else. When I was a child, we always had missionary speakers come to our church. And that was a very influential way for me to broaden my very, very small context. Introduce any change well. Because if you introduce something one time and it doesn't go well, how hard is it to introduce it again? How many of you in your church have ever tried to introduce like a building remodel or something? And it's been introduced 5 times and now nobody wants to hear about it. Anything like that, and they're jaded on that, no way. So I tell students all the time about introducing choral works. You better introduce it well the first time because the second week is too late. They've already made a judgment on it. So make sure you give a good sell from the start. And there are many ways to do that, but make sure it's done well. Resources are helpful. Provide a context for new multicultural elements. Most often, a personal context about how this is meaningful, why this is meaningful. When I was here, I have a friend who, I met a person once, when I was in Mexico, when whatever, something like that is very much important. Choral repertoire is a very good place to start. It's a really, really good place because the people that sing in choir, I believe, are always the more flexible people in congregations usually. They're already used to thinking in some bit broader terms and experimenting, and there are just lots of things, movement, things like that. Most people are willing to try. Involve people from different cultures as leaders. It's a really good way to do that. I have gotten to where when I'm teaching some new language in a choral setting, I hardly ever teach any, I haven't taught anything language-wise in probably 5 or more years. Because why would I not get somebody else, a student to teach it, another student, or another teacher, or why would I not get somebody real to do this? And plus, it's not my best suit. I'm not very good at it. So, but it's much more believable if I find someone else. Evaluate leadership structures that limit multicultural involvement. And sometimes our leadership structures just aren't flexible enough. That would be one of the ways. I think that the last thing that I would say is heaven is multicultural. And if we do not become multicultural here, it's hard to imagine how we might enjoy heaven. I have met people, and you know people, and there are many people I think in our world who I just cannot imagine being anything but absolutely miserable in heaven. I think heaven for them would be hell. Because they just don't like anybody different than they are, and anything that's not their idea, or isn't something with which they are familiar, or they're the first ones to think of. So that's a very strong statement, and maybe I shouldn't have said that, but I do believe that. And I do believe that heaven is complete. We cannot believe the Bible and not believe that heaven is very multicultural. And I think it's just going to be absolutely amazing. But I think what's going to be interesting, instead of being in a culture where I don't know the dance and I don't have the best moves and all that, I think I'm going to have all the right moves. And all the right stuff. And it's just going to be amazing. So thank you all so much for being part of this session.